Alright, welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at episode 4 of Extra History series on the Incan Empire. This time we're taking a look at their show Andean Apocalypse, which I believe is going to be discussing the arrival of smallpox and other diseases from the north that were carried over to the Americas by the Spanish. That's my assumption, especially given the look of the thumbnail, which has a very cool Grim Reaper looking figure, as well as an amorphous uh, red blob that I'm assuming means or is meant to be a representation of the disease that shows up. Either way, we're going to go ahead and dive into this. I'm very excited to see this because we're now starting to get into the downfall and the kind of fascinating structure at which that is. I know that they don't ultimately look at Atahualpa's fall and the arrival of the conquering by Pizarro in this one, because that is the next episode. But either way, this is a moment that might as well be apocalyptic. 40 years after the arrival of the Spanish, huge chunks, huge swaths of native populations would have been directly and irrevocably hit by disease that is coming through the trade routes and through the distant travelers inside of their own empires.
In 32, Francisco Pizarro is shocked by what he sees. On his first expedition 4 years ago, he had landed in this very city. It's where he learned about the so-called Inca Empire he'd come to conquer. Then, there had been 1,000 stone buildings, large seagoing rafts in the harbor with great white sails. Crowds had come out to greet them, to offer gifts and touch the strange white and black skin of the foreigners. Now, it was a ruin. Most of the populace, it seemed, had fled. He directs his translator, a native man he'd kidnapped during the last expedition, to ask one question. What happened here? The answer: plague, death, and civil war.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
It came from the north. Everyone was sure of it. It turned people's skins black and made blood flow from their nose and mouths. And it was almost always fatal. Today, we assume this disease was hemorrhagic smallpox or measles, likely swept down from Mexico, where Cortez's men had brought it to the Aztec Empire. But the inhabitants...
And it ravaged the Aztecs. The Aztecs initially successfully removed Cortez and his forces from the city. But the disease that he leaves behind ultimately cripples the ability of the city to defend itself. So when he arrives later with a larger force, they're able to sweep through and conquer the Aztec Empire without nearly as much of a fight as you would have expected given the size and scope of the Aztec Empire. And you can see that disease showing up is already ravaging the territories and its effects.
Of the Inca Empire had no name for the illness that ravaged them. There's no way to solidly estimate the impact of this plague upon the Inca population. But in some areas, the population may have dropped 90%. And no one was spared. No one. When the sickness reached the empire, Emperor Huayna Capac was up north in Quito, the place he'd fashioned into the second city of his empire, and where he marshaled his forces to crush rebels in what is now Ecuador and Colombia. He was no fool. He isolated himself. But the strange marks found him anyway. Within days, he was dying. And fearing that the emperor was about to make his transition into the spirit world, the royal court asked him to name a successor. He did. The son he named, though, was already dead. A victim of the same illness which had swept through the royal court. Though the Spanish did not know it, they didn't understand disease transmission well enough to use it intentionally, they had effectively decapitated the Inca political leadership before Pizarro's men had even arrived.
And this isn't just the Inca. This is pretty much universal. And I always bring this up, and the researchers are likely 100% correct. The vast majority of people that die in this situation are likely dying of smallpox or versions of smallpox and measles. But realistically, there are dozens of theoretical diseases being brought over. This is a population that hadn't since interacted with or seen the diseases created in the old world with time for 10,000 years. The number of things that are going to build up and be possible to ravage a population are immense. And we're talking about the fact that before the arrival of the Spanish, anywhere from 50 to 100 million people lived in North and South America. Over the next 100 years after that, 50 to 90% of those populations are dead. When the individuals arrive to found Plymouth in what is today New England and Massachusetts, they end up founding Plymouth in an abandoned village, an abandoned native village that is abandoned because of plague and disease that has ravaged the local population. And this is a fairly common reality across the spectrum for native populations during this period. It is the disastrous reality of long-term isolation. It's one of the reasons why areas like, say, the North Sentinelese Islands and their inhabitants are legally not allowed to be in contact with outsiders, because they will likely die of the diseases that are transmitted. And if you're wondering specifically why that's the case, typically we tend to see diseases develop in a few different ways. A, when humans are regularly and consistently in contact with large numbers of animals, because that regular contact makes it more likely that animal-borne diseases are going to jump and move to human beings, which is rare. And then there is also the reality of cities. Major city regions are far more likely to see the development of a brand new disease than a rural one because of the high population density. And in much of the Americas, the population density isn't that large to create large opportunities for diseases to develop. The Incans, the Aztecs, and before them the Mayans and the Olmecs are unique cases. Once you get into what is today the United States and Canada, it's odd to see a large population center. They did exist. Areas like Cahokia in what is today Illinois have around 33,000 people at their peak. But that's not to say that they don't have much smaller populations compared to the big cities of Europe or Asia during this time. And those higher population densities and higher and larger cities are more likely to develop new diseases, which is probably why we see dozens of diseases introduced to the natives and very few. One, I believe, is been proven to have originated in the Americas and come over. That's a pretty big dichotomy. And there's a number of reasons why.
Both the Sapa Inca and his heir apparent dead, the rest of the empire was left to decide who would rule. Back in
Civil
Cusco,
War.
the nobles appointed one of the emperor's sons, Huascar, as the new ruler, which may not have been the best choice, as Huascar was a drunken party boy who had the habit of stealing other nobles' wives and then executing them if they objected. He also made moves to seize lands and estates held by his mummified predecessors and their families. Or maybe not, because the accounts that claim that come from a Spanish chronicler who got the story from his Inca wife, a woman who was previously married to Huascar's half-brother and rival for the throne, a man named Atahualpa. Though Atahualpa and Huascar were both sons of the emperor, they had different mothers, with Huascar's mother being Inca and Atahualpa's mother coming from a non-Inca northern royal line. Temperamentally, they couldn't have been more different. While Huascar grew up steeped in the court life of Cusco, Atahualpa had traveled and fought with his father in the Inca's northern campaigns. Huascar had the loyalty of the Cusco elite, and Atahualpa had the hearts of the battle-hardened army. So when the nobles of Cusco declared Huascar to be the Sapa Inca and Atahualpa to be the governor of Quito, it was pretty clear what was about to happen. Civil war.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And specifically, we see this throughout history as well. I know that I say that a lot, that we see this throughout history. And it's because there's certain patterns that you notice. And throughout many times, in especially monarchical setups, there are, without clear rules for succession, for who comes next, there is a high likelihood of conflict. And that's what sparks a lot of civil wars and a lot of international conflicts throughout European history, as well as Asian and African and into Native American groups. If there is competition between these different groups, that's going to lead to conflict. It's going to lead to war. And I already kind of gave away who's going to come out on top. But this is going to further weaken the Incan Empire before the arrival of Pizarro's forces to conquer it. And that also goes to show the reality that bias is incredibly real and incredibly apparent in a lot of traditional sourcing for these types of historical tales. We don't have always a clear picture. We've had several times throughout history, and a lot of historians do their best to remain as unbiased as possible and as objective as possible. But there does need to be a discussion about the possibility of trying to paint a picture in a safe light. That's what lost causers do. Not well. The lost cause myth is not good. It's not accurate. But you can see in that creation, in that reality, that people are going to write what makes them feel and look better in a lot of cases, especially if there is not the ethical background or the moral backing behind making sure that it is as objective as possible. And with the limited amount of actual Incan records from the period, we don't know what kind of leader Huascar would have been or was. As we have Atahualpa's story, who ends up winning the war.
Now, a little civil war was, to be honest, not really a big deal. Practically expected. With no concept of primogeniture, it was normal for the Incas to fight a few battles to figure out who would succeed. Indeed, if a claimant had the
primogeniture, by the way, is the order in which an individual would get the throne. That is your line of succession. And because of regular civil wars like this, there's a reason why they know the line of succession for the royal family in England to like the 700th person or some crazy nonsense like that. Because they don't want the possibility of an armed conflict like this.
The guile, military skill, and fortitude to defeat his rivals. Wouldn't that actually prove he was the best man for the job? And it was clear that Atahualpa wanted the royal tassel. Therefore, when Atahualpa sent a delegation to present Huascar with coronation gifts, the emperor refused the gifts, killed the ambassadors, and sent the military captains back, dressed in women's clothing. A declaration of civil war.
Yep.
It was not the greatest idea, though. After all, Atahualpa was up in Quito, where their father had been fighting, with all of his battle-hardened troops, and his best generals, who were all loyal to Atahualpa, who was also part northern and had major support.
Yeah, that is a huge reality. If you have the loyalty of the troops, there's very little that a standard government can do against you. That's ultimately the reality. These are battle-hardened, experienced men, and usually experience is going to outpace numbers, at least to a reasonable degree. So even if the governing council, the nobles in Lima, is it Lima? It's Cusco. In Cusco are able to put together enough troops to field against Atahualpa, they don't have the experience, they don't have the training necessary to go to a prolonged conflict with them.
Atahualpa was also far north and already fighting against rebellions that predated the Civil War, not to mention now these new provincial rebellions that supported Huascar. And Huascar had his own assets, namely the royal tassel, the capital, and the larger army. He marched north, in some accounts even capturing Atahualpa, who then supposedly proceeded to escape after a woman smuggled him in a jailbreak kit during a drunken victory party. But here's what's not in doubt. This war was vicious and costly. It ripped the empire apart, and in concert with the ongoing smallpox pandemic, may have dropped populations in some regions by 95%. The empire, already under strain during Huayna Capac's reign, teetered on the brink of collapse. The turning point came when the two armies met in central Ecuador. Huascar's force was much larger, led by a veteran general known as the Fox. But it was also made up of militia conscripts unused to war. Where Atahualpa's force, on the other hand, was a battle-hardened army made up from the best troops in the empire. Men drafted from warrior societies who the Inca from birth prepared for war. Experienced slingers from the Andes, hard Ecuadorian infantrymen, and archers from the Amazon who dipped their arrows in serpent venom and frog toxins. The battle did not last long. For if history teaches us one thing, it's the age-old adage, don't bring conscripts to a hardened veteran fight.
That's the reality. The experience is going to overtake numbers when it comes to something like this. Even incredibly impressive leaders tend not to be able to get a conscript force, a militia force, to actually overpower a group. Very often. It is rare. And the reality that goes along with that is this is not an easy fight. Remember, the terrain in this region is brutal. So even more so than, say, in an open Western Plains area, experience in this type of terrain and conflict is almost infinitely more important than numbers. It's not surprising that they came out on top.
Seriously, that's all over historical text. You can look that up. When it was all over, though, Atahualpa had the Fox's skull made into a gold-accented drinking cup. He'd killed the captured general by filling him with arrows and darts. An omen for what was to come. At first, Atahualpa tried to lure soldiers away from Huascar's retreating army with offers of clemency. However, when those offers to defect went unanswered, he turned to another tactic: terror. When he captured the enemy, he had them slaughtered and their bodies desecrated. Settling in the northern city of Cajamarca, he sent his army ahead with orders to take Cusco. And it did not take long. Atahualpa's bloody tactics had destroyed the enemy morale, and Huascar had lost his nerve. Even when Huascar's army occupied forts where they had an advantage of terrain and defensive barriers, they often failed to hold. So when Atahualpa's army reached Cusco, Huascar evacuated rather than fight. Soon he was a captive, and his legacy destroyed. And when we say destroyed, we mean destroyed. One of Atahualpa's generals entered Huascar's family compound, where his wives and children lived, and spared no one regardless of age or gender. Then they rounded up the historians who kept the records of Huascar's reign, those who knew what each knot represented on the quipu that kept royal history, and they killed them.
Yeah, and this is something else beyond that. This has been kind of an age-old idea of remove any future threat. Children, descendants can hold a grudge. Corpses can't. And there's a pragmatic reality behind that. It doesn't make any of it less terrible. And this is where we get to the further reality here that we don't know what Huascar's reign actually ends up being like, because they eliminate the people who could tell us, who could actually keep the records or maintain those records. The attempt to erase an opponent in a civil war or also makes a certain level of sense, and in a brutalist way. Strong records and knowledge of civil wars tends to give people ideas that, oh, well, he usurped the throne successfully. What if I wanted to usurp the throne? And that can cause other issues long term. There is a brutality within it. And yeah.
Afterward, they burned the quipu, even though the people trained to interpret them were dead. And then they destroyed the mummies of his most powerful ancestors. All of this in front of the deposed emperor's own eyes. His victory complete, Atahualpa prepared to march south and enter Cusco. There were things to attend to, not the least of them weeks of victory feasts to celebrate his coronation. But there was another matter that kept him. A force was marshaling behind him, heading south toward Cajamarca. They were not allies of his half-brother, that was certain. Reports from survivors said these strangers had pale skin and wore clothing made of metal. They rode enormous beasts, larger than llamas, and evil long-fanged creatures trotted at their heels. And they used bizarre weapons that made a noise like thunder and expelled smoke.
It's the Spanish.
Most importantly, though, reports said that they killed as they marched. Everywhere they went, they killed without reason, captured anyone they could, and questioned them under torture. They wanted to know the way to the emperor and his gold. Such impertinence, Atahualpa thought. Such belligerence from a force of only 168 men. They were, of course, conquistadors, Pizarro's third expedition. Yes. And though they carried documents from the Spanish crown, making it their duty to claim Peru for Spain and Christianize the population, they were actually here for the money.
Yeah.
This venture was an entrepreneurial one, and each man on it was a shareholder. If he enlisted with infantry weapons, he gained a small slice of whatever treasure they captured. But if the men who'd brought horses, plate armor, and contributed ships and provisions, men like their leader Pizarro and one of his captains Hernando de Soto, they could get very rich indeed.
Yeah, and this brings us to kind of the driving forces behind that early colonization, that early imperialist spree by the Spanish. And it's the 3 G's: God, glory, and gold. God, because they are ostensibly there to Christianize, note the air quotes, civilize these groups, bring them into the fold of what Spain followed, which is Roman Catholicism. It is glory. Many of these individuals, now by 32, are not direct veterans of the long, hard-fought Reconquista in Spain, but they are in their legacy, and they are there to build on that. And that legacy is one of hundreds of years, centuries of conflict with their southern neighbors, and that breeds a certain level of expectation for military forces. And in successfully overthrowing or overpowering a rival, brought a certain level of glory within society. And then finally, you've got the gold. Well, we've talked about this in the last episode with the llamas, with the golden llamas and the golden artistry that was created in this region. The Andes are rich in it, and they have a lot. And Pizarro's building off of what Cortez has already done in central Mexico, which is conquer a major native power and consolidate their riches for himself. And this is what they want. And it's going to be brutal in the process.
But Pizarro was already very rich indeed.
Yeah.
In fact, he was a veteran of several conquistador raids, but he was also aging. and wanted to make his mark on the world the same way Cortez had done when he overthrew the Aztec Empire. He carried documents in his pocket that, once the Incas were overthrown, would make him the Spanish governor of Peru. So he was surprised when a group of Incan ambassadors met them on the road, bearing gifts. It seemed they would be received. The Sapa Inca, his translator said, wanted to meet them. Pizarro didn't realize that the gifts were a threat, the Inca's usual modus operandi of displaying their generosity, that, if spurned, would lead to annihilation. Each item carefully selected to send a message. So Pizarro and his men walked deeper into Atahualpa's territory, drawn into a position where the Incan army of 40,000 could envelop their little party. Pizarro and Atahualpa were about to come face to face in a meeting that would shatter an empire, not to mention cost both men their lives.
Yep, and we'll finish that up next week. We are nearing the end of the Incan Empire, and we are to the brutal reality of the Spanish conquest. There is going to be a lot to discuss when we get there, but I hope you'll join me for that last episode next week. If you have any other suggestions, any other ideas, please let me know. Please put them in the comments down below, and have a great day. Bye.